Welcome to the Progress Texas Happy Hour.
Welcome to the Progress Texas Happy Hour. I'm Executive Director Kathleen Thompson.
And I'm Advocacy Manager Reagan Stone.
Since 2009, the nonprofit Texas Tribune has taken on complex issues and put them in a context that folks across our state can understand. We think of them as the creme de la creme, or one might say the best guacamole in Texas. From their co-founders, including the late venture capitalist John Thornton and veteran journalists Ross Ramsey and Evan Smith, we're proponents that the entire team has been serving us what Thornton defined capital J journalism as a public good.
Those names you mentioned are legends, Kathleen. And as I've mentioned on the pod before, I'm one of those weird kids that grew up on PBS. We only had like 5 or 6 TV channels in my household. And so public media and a public good like this is all too important to me, as I know to many of our listeners as well. I'm a fanboy for Evan Smith, and my inner child would compare him to icons like Gwen Ifill on the NewsHour or even Ken Burns. After all, the Texas Tribune is telling Texas's story.
Our first guest began in 2015 at the Trib as a reporter, then managing editor, and has served as editor-in-chief since September 2024. Matthew Watkins is a Texas native born in Space City who grew up in Austin. He graduated from A&M and before the Trib reported for the Bryan College Station Eagle and the Dallas Morning News. Matthew Watkins has an extensive knowledge of the legislature and the budget process, and today we're looking forward to learning more about where the Trib is heading under his leadership. Thanks for coming on the Happy Hour, Matthew.
Thank you, Kathleen and Reagan. Great to be here. I'm particularly honored by your guacamole reference. The Tribune, famously among ourselves, has Guacamole Thursday, where we serve guacamole in our break room every Thursday. So feels like a good match to me.
Well, our next guest is no stranger to Texas politics or the national spotlight either. Eleanor Klibanoff has worked at public radio stations in numerous states. Her work is aired on All Things Considered, Morning Edition, and Here and Now. She's from Atlanta originally, attended GW in DC, and fun fact, she's conversational in Spanish. Eleanor Klibanoff currently serves as the women's health reporter for the Texas Tribune and covers a wide range of other topics around the state. Welcome to the podcast, Eleanor.
Thank you for having me.
So, Matthew, we're going to get started with you, and we'd just like to get to know you a bit more personally. And in lining up this question for our audience, I'll note the Texas Tribune also has a podcast, the Texas Tribune Tribcast. You can find it anywhere you find your pods. I'll say first, I love the informal beginnings. It's like catching up with friends, but y'all also do such a nice job in cutting big topics into bite sizes. Matthew, in at least one of those openings, your compadres on the pod seem to characterize you as a big nerd. And no hard feelings here. I think of myself like that sometimes. My question here is that a fair assumption, and where does it come from? And then parting from that, when you're not at the office, what's some activities that allow you a break from all the madness in Austin?
Yeah, I guess the nerd, label probably fits. Although I would warn my co-host Eleanor against throwing, stones from glass houses. But
it's sort of. I think it's like the barrier to entry at the Tribune. We're not the jocks, I would say.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, I think there's 2 types of people. There's the people who show up at the Texas Capitol and just are like, wow, this is so fascinating. This is so exciting. Who get really kind of just swept up in it. And then there's the other people who kind of come in and are sort of appalled and want nothing to do with it. And I, for better or worse, am of that kind of former category. I'm the group that really gets swept in, which, and, I think, it's a few different things, right? Like, Eleanor, this is probably true of you too, but like, I love to read. I love to kind of engage with like topics that I find really interesting. That is just sort of what I do in my spare time in addition to in my work time. And so, it's just a lot of fun to be able to do that as a living. For a living. And then the other thing is just that I really care and I'm interested in Texas, right? I've lived here my entire life. I grew up here. there's so much, it's such a complicated and rich state. We were talking before we started recording. I was in Marfa this past weekend, right? And the idea that like a place like Marfa, in a place like Austin, in Dallas, in Lufkin, in Lubbock, in Brownsville, that like all those different places could be part of the same state. And the things that we have in common and the things, kind of unique things we bring apart. It's just like, it's a real pleasure to be able to travel the state to talk to all these just incredibly interesting, passionate, unique, flawed people, and kind of tell the story of the state. And so, if that makes me a nerd, so be it. But
it does. It does. Really but that's okay. Yeah. Yeah.
It's a beautiful answer coming from a fellow nerd.
Yeah.
And Eleanor, I've listened to you open your podcasts, and you really do seem to have a lot of fun with your colleagues. Teasing aside, razzing aside, you all have a lot of different personalities. So whether you're teasing Matthew or just talking about your weekend, it feels like the joy is contagious. Do you have this much fun in all parts of your life, or are you trying and working and being mindful of spicing up Texas politics?
That's a good question. I think we have a lot of fun at work. I mean, I think a lot of what we do is often pretty like fun is maybe the wrong word, but like exciting and high adrenaline and interesting. And like Matthew said, like we get to like meet a lot of interesting people and hear a lot of interesting stories. And certainly I think particularly around the legislature, like our newsroom is a pretty lively place. There's a lot of like camaraderie around like trying to chase down the same legislators, trying to get the same, people to talk to us. And there's something sort of funny about like working in the Capitol. And, you see your colleagues, you see legislators, you see lobbyists, you see people you kind of know. And it's like everyone is there under one roof, sort of for the same thing. It has sort of almost like, I like to say, like summer camp vibes a little bit, like you're seeing old friends and people are finding their way. And so I think particularly around the legislature, we have a lot of fun at work and sort of a lot of good camaraderie. I think I have, fun in my normal life too. Eleanor
is the self-proclaimed social chair of the Texas Tribune newsroom. So
that is also true.
That's great.
Yes. Yes, we recently, you want to talk about being nerds about things. We have had a lot of discontent in the newsroom about where we do our happy hours. Everyone has a different opinion about where it should be. And so I made a survey and made everyone take a survey on where we should do our happy hours. And the results were wildly inconclusive. No one can agree. I was correct in my hypothesis that no one can agree on where we should do these. So I get to pick. You plan your own happy hours if you want to know, if you want to pick the bar.
It's a little bit of a roulette. We'll never be able to find where all the Tribune reporters are hanging out on a Friday now.
Exactly. We never stay in one place. Yeah, right.
Yeah. Well, Matthew, when we spoke last, y'all were getting ready to start the big plans of this kind of big deal festival y'all have each year. That's the 15th annual Tribune Festival, and you pose it as bringing the nation's boldest thinkers and doers for 3 days of exciting interviews and interactive experiences. I know you're in the beginning stages of getting things going, but what's at store for us this year? And if you can't spoil any surprises yet, what is it like working with Evan Smith on planning TribFest this year? Do y'all have like similar processes, or how does that work?
Yeah, Evan is an incredibly talented event organizer and host. And so he has traditionally programmed the TribFest, and we are sort of working together on it this year. And that is an adventure. In some ways, it's kind of learning from the master, but it's also kind of a terrifying look inside his brain, right? That never stops moving and moves incredibly quickly. So, I think we're going to have a really great festival this year. We're about 2 weeks out from announcing our sort of first batch of confirmed people, but we're going to have the usual slate of I'll phrase this a little differently. We are, as usual, going to have a slate of kind of nationally known, very prominent politicians. And then we're going to mix that in with some people who are really interesting on the state level and talk about a lot of different topics, right? So we're building panels related to education, to business and the economy, healthcare, energy, climate, technology, immigration, arts and culture. We're going to have a lot of authors talking about their books that are coming out this year and things like that. Topics on faith and in the media and everything like that. And what it is, we're trying to bring as many people who are nerds like Eleanor and I together to really engage in those conversations. It's a really fun program because you get to hear those really interesting conversations. You get to hear from really smart people, but then you sort of get to just kind of be in the same room as them and talk to them while they're waiting in line to see another panel or sidle up to them at the bar and ask them your own questions and everything like that. And it's really kind of built over the last 15 years into a big kind of destination event for people, not really just across the state, but the country. And something I really look forward to every year, because it does really feel like we're kind of with our people, in a way that you don't get to experience as much with, people are reading your articles, but you can't have as much of that sort of back and forth throughout the day.
I'll just add that, I don't know if you guys have heard, like, the White House Correspondents' Dinner, they sometimes call like the Oscars for ugly people.
Yes.
And I think we should
should
be rebranding TribFest as like ACL for nerds, unfortunately. ACL for smart people. ACL is smart people too. We'll say ACL for Austin City Limits for politics wonks.
I like that. I know a lot of nerds who go to ACL, so for sure.
Yeah, also that. Yeah,
the latter. Eleanor, you started at the Kentucky Center for Investigative Reporting before jumping to the Trib in 2021, and you have definitely brought that research and investigative spirit of reporting with you. And with a Texas beat that covers abortion, maternal health care, gender-based violence, LGBTQ plus issues, and more, I'm sure your work days are filled and could lead to some exhaustion. Will you talk to us about balancing the coverage on these issues that just decades ago would be too controversial to talk about, known as third rails? And after you answer that, will you tell us, are there any secrets in your sauce to beating burnout on one issue, even though it's so important and you must continue to cover it because people need to know?
Well, thank you for saying that. I appreciate that. It's been, I started here in November 2021, just a few months after Texas had banned abortion after about 6 weeks of pregnancy, which, like, at the time, like, now sort of seems like, par for the course, but at the time was like really shocking. And Texas had sort of found a way to circumvent the protections of Roe v. Wade. And when I started, I like to tell this story about how, among other people, Matthew was one of them who was like, this is not an abortion beat. And I was like, right, totally. And we all, I think across the aisle, many people thought the Supreme Court was going to overturn SB 8 and say, like, we have Roe v. Wade, you can't ban abortion. And about a week after I started, the Supreme Court upheld SB 8, and this very quickly became an abortion beat for a little while. And I've been able to report on a lot of other issues as well, but certainly this has been like the three years I've been in Texas have been like the three most transformational years for abortion access, reproductive rights in the country. And so it really was sort of a case of like right place, right time in terms of being able to cover such like a major historical moment. And that's been really, really fulfilling in a lot of ways, pretty nonstop. But I think the issue has evolved and the coverage has evolved. And it's been, I think as journalists, like, we are sort of drawn to wanting to be in the midst of like major sea changes, sort of regardless of like, we like to be where like the news is happening. And so I think being in Texas covering this issue for the last 3 years has been really, really fulfilling and really, like, I certainly like the best experience of my career, I think, in terms of feeling like I'm in the midst of a major news story. It can be certainly like exhausting after a while. And I think particularly when I first started, it was like very drinking from a fire hose and trying to get my feet under me on the beat and stuff. And then, about 8 months later, the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade. We banned abortion entirely. That was like the next wave of things. And it's been, sort of consistently since then. I will say, like, I am in terms of burnout, like, certainly I think like the Tribune has been very good about, and I think this across all of our beats, like we like to say, like any one of our topic areas could have like a desk of reporters covering them. Like we just can't cover everything all the time. And like, we shouldn't sort of aspire to do that. But I think, picking where we want to land, and really saying like, what do we want to cover, what do we want to cover the hell out of? And, what do we want to pull back on? And I also think it's just very rewarding to feel like, I have my role to play. I find the work to be very fulfilling. And, in tumultuous times, which I would say is most of the decade I've been in journalism, it feels nice to feel like I know what my job is in all of this, and it's to go out and tell those stories.
Yeah, the overturning of Roe v. Wade, I feel like it's one of those moments, right, where it's like you'll remember where you were when it happened, right? And I remember that I was sitting right next to you, Eleanor, right, refreshing the Supreme Court sign. And right, we had, we, of course, y'all will remember, like we had a pretty good sense of what was going to happen by that time. It was just a matter of, putting a plan together and then responding. And, so I remember, refreshing, reading the end of that ruling,
right,
putting
scrolling
your story up immediately. And then, you kind of added some quotes to that story and then immediately got in the car and drove to San Antonio, right? And went to a clinic that we knew would be sort of shutting down that day. And then, Eleanor was then working, pretty much nonstop for the next several days, writing, probably somewhere around a dozen stories about the impact on that state. And, when one of those, I think one of the reasons like people get into journalism, right? I don't want to speak too much for you, Eleanor, so correct me if this doesn't reflect your reality, but is because you want to kind of be a part of the action. And I think there's something comforting when something major is going on to feel like you have a job to do, you have a story to tell, and that kind of helps focus you and push you forward. And there have been a lot of events like that in Texas over the last few years, some positive, some negative, but many of them monumental, right? And, one of the good things about being at the Tribune is that we know our role in those moments, and it's just a matter of executing the plan and stepping up and doing it. And Eleanor definitely, achieved that on that day in that week.
And continues to do so. Yeah.
So thank you.
I have a question next for both of you. You both now have numerous legislative sessions under your belt. What's different this year under the Pink Dome right now? Any favorite stories that you want to share? We're talking about you're covering really heavy work and the importance of bringing it to Texans in a way that they can understand, but also there are interesting things that happen. Anything that you'd want to share with our audience? And Matthew, let's start with you.
Yeah, I think the thing that stands out to me the most about this legislative session is, so far at least, the House and the Senate seem to be very much on the same page, at least from leadership's perspective, in a way that really only compares to the 2019 session. The 2019 session was a session where they passed a major property tax bill and a major school finance bill, kind of reworking the school finance system in Texas. And it was really the one session where the Speaker of the House and the Lieutenant Governor were not kind of at each other's throats for most of the session, right? I think so far, it feels like we are in another such session this year. It started off rocky in that regard, right? There was a divided House and Dan Patrick, really sort of fighting against the election of the Speaker, Dustin Burrows. And I guess maybe more particularly fighting against the election of Dade Phelan before he bowed out of the race. But since then, I think Burrows has done a very impressive job in sort of kind of mending those wounds and getting everyone sort of moving in the same direction. I think if you talk to people in the lieutenant governor's office, they feel, pretty cautiously optimistic about how things are going so far and how the two chambers are working together. For many of the Progress Texas audience, that might be more of a bad thing than a good thing, because it means the very conservative people leading this state are facing fewer roadblocks in terms of accomplishing what it is that they want to accomplish. And it's important to note that we still have about a month and a half left in the session, and this is usually the time when things get the most tense. So we'll see whether that holds. But I think from the leadership perspective, it's so far so good in sort of keeping the peace. And that is really notable because, in the past, the way bills fail in the legislature in Texas is not usually, at least, because people are voting against it. It's because they run out of time, or they get so kind of caught up fighting each other that they have a hard time accomplishing them. And that's not really what's happening this session so far.
Yeah, what I remember most about 2019 was a moderating of some positions, but I think that was a little bit of fear of constituency changing, the voter, turnout changing after the 2018 election, and wanting to be seen as a little bit more bipartisan and focus more on core issues than extreme right, red meat based items.
Right. It was right after the Beto O'Rourke race. Republicans had lost a bunch of seats in the House. 12 seats
in the House and 2 seats in the Senate, right? That's a lot.
Exactly. And there was a legitimate question about whether that next session, whether Democrats might win win control of the House, right? That, of course, didn't end up happening. This time it's different, right? But it is also true that there was a one-time speaker, who ended up kind of, going down in flames in a scandal, afterwards, right? But this session, we don't have that sort of, I think, we're coming off an election in which Republicans have very high confidence in their majority and everything like that. So that is different compared to 2019. But I think there are similar sort of kumbaya moments going on between the leadership, at least right now. We'll see if it sticks.
And how about you, Eleanor? Anything interesting that you'd want to share that's happening right now, or maybe tell us how you have a lens with other state legislatures, what may be different in Texas?
Yeah, I was going to say, last session was my first session in Texas, and I really felt like I was understanding it and getting the rhythm and feeling like, wow, I get what's happening here. And then they tried to impeach the attorney general. And I was like, I do not understand what is happening here anymore. So I had to learn a whole new set of things that everyone had to learn at the same time. So if I have learned anything, it's that April 15th predictions mean very little about, how the rest of this might go. But I think we were talking about this a little bit just before. I spent some time covering the legislature in Kentucky, though not sort of as my full-time focus here in Texas. And just the gap in size between a legislature in Kentucky and Texas is really, when I first moved here and I told one of my friends in Kentucky that the legislature files close to 10,000 bills a session here, she was like, I think maybe you just misunderstood what they were saying. I'm certain that could not possibly be the case. They file just north of about 1,000 bills a session in Kentucky. They do meet every year. It just, I don't think anyone feels like their state legislature works well. But I think when you look at the scale of what's happening in Texas and the number, this is the thing we talked about a lot on the Tribcast, is why do they file so many bills? And why do they all file the same bill? And why do they all file the same bill? And they don't just sign you. There's a mechanism to co-author a bill, just co-author it. But no, they all must file it themselves, and that's fine. So that's been a big difference here. It's just, a lot of folks, a lot of people, and a lot of people wanting their names on a lot of things.
San Antonio friends, Progress Texas is proud to welcome Mayor Ron Nierenberg as our guest for a live podcast taping at our Party for Progress on Tuesday, May 6th, and you're invited. We look forward to a long overdue visit to Alamo City. Again, mark that date, Tuesday, May 6th, live pod taping with Mayor Ron Nierenberg and good fun with you in San Antonio. See the show notes and get your tickets right now. And thanks to Austin Kaplan and the Kaplan Law Firm, Julianne Reeves, Tracy Miller, Will Judy, and more for their generous support of our San Antonio Party for Progress.
Matthew, we don't always ask, the hardest questions on this podcast, and by no means do I mean these to be extremely difficult or pain points. I listened to a recent Tribcast podcast yesterday, and y'all were talking about Lieutenant Governor Patrick's proposed THC ban, SB 3, which is now facing the Texas House right now. That week's episode was sponsored by the Beer Alliance of Texas, and that trade organization, along with the Wholesale Beer Alliance of Texas, has been pushing for this bill, even forming a marketing campaign around banning THC. Without getting into the nitty gritty of synthetic versus natural, or the fact that a majority of Texans want a regulated cannabis market, how do you decide what to cover? And is it what interests the Trib reporters or Patrick's priorities? I mean, I'm hoping it's not that, but at the same time, what's the method there?
Yeah, let me sort of peel back the curtain for how we do the Tribcast, because the question of how do we pick the topics is largely Eleanor and I talk about what we're interested in, right? And I think I was probably the one who pushed for the THC one because I am especially interested in that topic. I just think it's an interesting thing, right? You mentioned, right, there is voters, if you look at the polls, voters support legalizing marijuana, or at least, decriminalizing marijuana is probably the better way of putting it. That being said, we had this situation where the legislature, in an attempt to boost agriculture, voted to decriminalize certain types of hemp, and it created, I think, what can only be fairly described as a sort of unintended consequence of which led to, all these kind of shops popping up selling, Delta 9, Delta, insert your number here, and other kind of THC substances that can have, a similar, or if not sort of exactly the same effect, on people, intoxicating effect. It gets advertised in that way, right? And so you had this sort of unintended situation where, marijuana-like products are sort of being not regulated at all, which was sort of clearly not the intention of the legislature, but also sort of aligns with the wishes of the people in the state. And so I find that kind of tension very interesting. And I also kind of find it funny, you like drive around downtown Austin, you'll sometimes see the Big Dan's weed van, which I always wonder, like, is that like a personal, like, is that supposed to be like related to Dan Patrick? Are they like trying to...
I didn't think of that.
Only funny to us? Yes.
Yeah, exactly. But, or do they not even know who Dan Patrick is? I don't know.
Right.
But anyways, so I suggested that topic to Eleanor. And so what we do is, we kind of map out our topics for 2 or 3 weeks in advance, with allowing for breaking news to kind of change that, and then we share that with our sort of sponsorship team, and they then can go out and sell sponsorships or offer sponsorships to people who want to buy it. So presumably what happened is that our sponsorship team knew that this was a topic that would be of interest to the beer distributors and asked whether they would be interested in buying an ad. We then go, prepare for the show, whatever. And then right before we go to record it, we look at our little spreadsheet as to who the ad, who has the ads. And we add that to our script for what to do, right? So the decision of what we're going to cover or what we're talking about is made completely independently from who is going to sponsor the show. We don't ask our salespeople what they want us to cover, and they don't tell us what they want us to cover. But what they do tell us is who's going to pay to have their advertising read on the show, and we'll then read that script. So I think it's a good question. I think transparency and all these things is is the way to go. But no, we don't allow sort of those conversations to be influenced by the sponsorship or even the sponsorship opportunities. We'll decide we want to talk about abortion, which is not particularly an issue that a lot of advertisers want to get involved with, but we feel
I don't think we had a sponsor for that episode.
Yeah,
Nobody
that
wants to
reminds me
sponsor
of like
abortion.
a Men episode where they're all sitting in a room, like, who wants to buy this ad for, the first time that was ever shown on TV or something. But it's like kind of a follow-up in some way. And this is, kind of coming from where Progress Texas and my heart, my so-called beat. I'm not a reporter, but in a way I, amplifies stories from different parts of the state. And a lot of that is around environmental justice. And another example, getting out of the weeds here, is carbon capture. And, I attended TribFest last year, and there was a large presence of a major sponsor, Chevron. And we get it. One of the biggest oil and gas places in the world. I was about to say state, but in the entire world. And they were talking about their plans of trapping polluting CO2 and putting it underground. And just from our perspective, Progress Texas, Sierra Club, many other allies, we label this as not fully realized technology. It's greenwashing kind of in our messaging playbook. My question is, how does the advertising, you already kind of put this, but I'm going to ask it in a little different way, but how does the advertising work into your mission of telling the full story? Especially in these like new days of nonprofit journalism? And is there room for like the Edward Abbeys of our modern environmental movement in the Tribune's, storytelling? I was almost joking in my head, like, are they setting up a pro bono booth next to Chevron? Or, maybe there's just, there is a seminar that you're going to have Chevron and someone else up there, and asking them both tough questions in that. But how do you weigh that balance?
Yeah, I mean, I think the key is we have to make sure we're letting our journalists do their job without interference or influence from the sources of our funding, right? Journalism is expensive to produce, right? We have to pay the salary of our reporters. We have to pay for the travel, all across the state, our office space, our, all the other things that go into it, right? I think people are reasonable in asking their questions about like, what is the influence that money has on journalism? It's also something that, has always sort of been a topic of conversation, right? When I worked at kind of print newspapers around the state, right? Like we were, running stories about, issues with car safety, right next to Toyota ads and everything like that, right? And there's always a little bit of maybe a sense of uncomfortableness around that, but like ultimately, like that is what pays the bills. But what we, make sure we do is we are clear with anyone who gives us money that the only thing that their money is paying for is to support our journalism and to get their message out, to our readers, right? And what I mean by that is through the advertisement that they're buying or the, sponsorship, booth at the festival or anything like that. What it does not buy you the right to do is to influence our work in any way. And, we're clear with that. You have to draw a very firm line, right? You can never get into gray area. You can never be like, oh, well, they want this, so we have to do that, because then you'd have to explain to the next person why you gave it to one person and not the other. And basically the trust of our readers, in maintaining that trust and maintaining our kind of integrity, once you lose that, it's sort of gone forever, right? The other thing that we really try to do because of that is to try to have very diverse revenue streams, right? So we do not rely on any one funder. We raise money from conservatives. We raise money from liberals. We raise money from moderates. We raise money from nonpartisan organizations, right? And so it is possible for anyone to kind of look and see, oh, Chevron gave them money, or oh, Sierra Club gave them money, and you can make an argument back there. What I always turn back to is like, look, we're getting money from both of those sides. So like, you know, I'm not sure you can necessarily say, right, like that any side is kind of putting their thumb on the scales or anything like that. And then the last one I would say is transparency, right? We disclose at the bottom of every story if we mention someone who has ever given us money, right? So if the Texas Public Policy Foundation gave us $1,000 to run an ad in 2014, you will see that they have been a financial supporter of us in a story that runs in 2025, right? And some people can maybe try to use that against us to raise doubt or everything, but we believe that transparency is really important, because I think what would be worse than that is sort of, you know, collecting a whole bunch of money from people with a particular agenda and not telling our readers that we got that money, right? And so for all those things, kind of maintaining the independence of our newsroom is kind of the most paramount, the most important thing, and the thing that we prioritize over everything else.
I think a really neat example again, and I look up to the Texas Tribune, and just like I was saying earlier to PBS and the NewsHour, and during the train derailments, we might remember in the train derailment in the Midwest a few years ago, one of the biggest supporters, I literally listen to the NewsHour almost every day, and I can like memorize the, you know, all the way to viewers just like you. And one of their advertisers is BNSF. And I can almost like say their advertisement, but they were like, that was who was having the train derailment. They were having the CEO on almost every evening. And then they would say, you know, BNSF is a sponsor of the NewsHour. But again, not holding back some more difficult questions. And so I really appreciate you answering it in it that way, Matthew. Thank you.
I can give like a funny example about our disclosures, which I think is like one of the things that really makes the Tribune really stand out, is like we do have those transparency disclosures on all of our stories about, you know, and often it is both sides who are yelling at each other have given us money. And so it sort of cancels each other out. But we had this funny disclosure, because again, it auto populates on our, you know, website, like this is who is named in this story that gave the Texas Tribune money. Several years ago, as you may recall, there was a bit of a thing in which our Attorney General, Ken Paxton, left his house in a hurry to avoid being served a subpoena. And I wrote that story, and we wrote in the story that he fled his home in a Chevy Tahoe. And at the end of the story, it said, Chevrolet has been a sponsor of the Texas Tribune. And it was sort of when, you know, was big on Twitter, because people were like, does the Tribune think that like they gave them name, like that they included that in there in some sort of like they bought presence in that story? And it's like, nope, just we disclose all of it, so we don't have to start weighing whether or not it's important to disclose that or not.
Yeah, and all of your you know, of course, your bylaws or your policies surrounding that are very easily findable on the Texas Tribune's website. And, you know, invite all the listeners, you know, definitely look in to, you know, how that's happening. But I think it's really interesting, and it's good to see that, you know, independent journalism has those ways to keep things balanced and to be, you know, fair to every single side.
Yeah, I mean, that's something that I think we talk about and think about a lot, right? Is there's a reason we're trying to be fair to every side, right? Like advocacy has its role, and it's a very important role, and it has, you know, led to a lot of great things in our country, right? But like we are really firm believers that in order to be a productive citizen, a productive voter, productive participant in democracy, you need to have a good understanding about what's happening, right? And you might think that Greg Abbott is the worst person on earth, or you might think that, you know, James Tallarico is the worst person on earth. But if you are only getting like a caricature of those people, if you're only getting like a sort of one-sided view of that person, you're not going to be very effective in advocating for what you want and getting what you want, you know? And so what we are trying to do is empower people with the information they need in order to be productive. And what we hope is you might read that disclosure at the bottom and say, that's interesting. But you'll have already read the entire story and feel like you've gotten a fair and honest portrayal of what's happened, right? And by then, you know, that disclosure won't won't mean that much to you, and you'll move on with your day, and you'll read the next story.
Matthew, you're bringing up part of our next topic, which is we've talked about some different issues specifically, but I want to talk about the importance of just independent media itself.
Yeah.
We're in a time where even corporate newsrooms with far more resources than yours or ours are targeted for just sharing the factual news of the day. And Eleanor, you're on a beat that I'm sure a lot of people would prefer you stop talking about and you stop writing about. And you don't go and give voice to women whose these laws are affecting and women are fleeing the state. Would you each talk about, in your own way, the importance of independent media at this time of crisis in our country?
Sure. I mean, I'll say, like, I think on my beat in particular, like, it's been very eye-opening. You know, when I was interviewing for this job, you know, there was a sense of like, you know, you sort of have to have a thick skin with this beat and with this topic. And, you know, you're going to get a lot of emails from people being very critical. And certainly I have gotten those. My email is often sort of a dumpster fire. But I think, you know, we get a lot of emails from people who are very, very anti-abortion saying like, thank you for writing about this. Like, we're winning. You're documenting, you know, we banned abortion. We did these things. And we get emails from people, you know, who are very pro-abortion saying, you know, thank you for writing about this. Thank you for writing about the negative consequences of these laws. And so in a lot of ways, it's like both sides are often very upset with us. Both sides are very, you know, happy with us for depending on the thing. And like, that doesn't really impact what we write about, right? Like, we love to hear from readers, and we often take under advisement like feedback that we get, but certainly we're not writing we're certainly not writing about abortion because to please people. It'd be a bit of a losing game, but I think I feel very lucky to be at the Tribune, to be at like a place that is, you know, really not beholden to anyone, right? Like, we're not beholden to corporate interests, we're not beholden to shareholders, we're not beholden to really anyone other than like in the broadest of senses, like our donors, but we also consider like the people we are beholden to be like Texans, right? Like, we consider our job to be, you know, telling what is happening in Texas to Texans for the good of Texas. And so that's not, you know, always the case. And so I think having that independent media, you know, even if all we're doing is saying like, this is what happened under the Capitol dome today, you know, creating a smarter, more informed Texas. And I think when I look for media covering like national news, for example, which I don't cover, and I have to go find that media like anyone else does, like any other news consumer does, you know, I think I look for similar, you know, hallmarks. I think a good example, like you said, like PBS. I think I remember this during the first Trump presidency, when it was like so many things were happening so fast and it was so chaotic in the very beginning and there was a lot of turnover. And I remember PBS NewsHour reported like a real uptick in people watching because they're like so calm and almost like boring sometimes in their coverage, that like when things are so exciting and so many things are happening all at once, like people just kind of want like balanced, often almost boring news of just like, this is what's happening. We don't need to put any, you know, spice on it. So I think I look for news organizations that have many of the same traits as the Tribune when looking for news elsewhere.
Yeah, I mean, I think it would be foolish not to acknowledge that it's a tough time for media right now. You know, don't love it when, you know, major political national leaders are calling the press the enemy of the people, or there's been bills this legislative session that have tried to kind of undermine some of our funding, right? And we've seen lawsuits brought against, you know, very prominent media outlets for doing things that were clearly just their job, right? And don't love that. Certainly not. But also, we're not going to stop doing what we're doing, because if we stop doing what we're doing, what's the point? We've already sort of lost our value, right? So we're going to keep telling the truth. We're going to keep aggressively reporting our stories. We're going to keep trying to be as fair as we can and honest as we can be about everything we write about. And if anyone goes after us for that, we'll deal with it when we can, but we're not going to, pull our punches or stop, unilaterally before that. And I hope that people from both political, sides of the equation view and respect that that's what we're doing, right? And that we're not at war with any one politician. We're not at war with any one party. We will talk to anyone who wants to talk to us. We will listen to anyone who wants to talk to us, and we will try to fairly and accurately portray the perspectives of anyone who will talk to us. And if people want to go after us for that, then that's fine. We'll just keep doing what we're doing.
I sometimes tell this story about during the first in the 2016 election, I was at a rally in Pennsylvania, and it was a Trump rally, and we were like, the press was like penned in the middle, which is like not atypical of like a big, auditorium hall. And they were doing the chanting of like, about the media and fake news and all of that. And this woman who's standing right up against the end of the pen, she was like there, and she was cheering, fake news and, lock up the press. And she and I had been chatting beforehand because I was just standing there. And she just turned to me and she said, "Well, not you, honey." And I feel like that's like sort of the truth of all of it. It's like, when you meet people, when you talk to people, when people know a journalist, when they understand what we do, when they understand who we are, like, I think it's hard to sort of disagree with what we're doing and how we do it. It's just sort of, it gets, used as a political football, but that doesn't mean that like that should change anything about what we do or how we do it.
And the media can do a better job, right, of being transparent and showing what our values are and the work that we do, right? And we talk about that a lot too, and are going to continue to kind of grow and get better at that as time goes on as well.
Well, thank y'all. Last kind of question here. Any plugs, last thoughts? Of course, we know the Waco Bureau has been hitting the news. Also, the limited run of a Tribcast pod. Does that mean y'all are ending it after the session? And let us know where we can hear you before then.
Yeah, Tribcast. Look us up in your podcasting apps or on YouTube, on the Tribune YouTube page, or you can just go to texastribune.org, search Tribcast, and you can find our stories. We have decided, we decided to kind of test it out and see through the session how it went and how it's going. I'm enjoying it a lot. I think Eleanor is too. But if you want to make sure that it keeps going on, then please tell all your friends to download and listen, and that will be the affirmation. Beyond that, yeah, right. You mentioned we're slowly kind of dipping our toe into local news. We're launching later this year a Waco local news site that will focus on stories about Waco for Wacoans. Stay tuned to that. The site is called Waco Bridge. You can go to wacobridge.org. We have not fully launched yet, but you can kind of sign up for our newsletter and things there if you're in that community. Stay tuned. We're gonna do the same in Austin later as well. And just keep following us at texastribune.org too. A lot is going to happen in the next month and a half. And we want to be the place that informs you about it.
Thanks to you both, Texas Tribune Editor-in-Chief Matthew Watkins and Women's Health Reporter Eleanor Klibanoff. Here at Progress Texas, we're working hard to scale our work to reach larger numbers of Gen X, Millennial, and Gen Z Texans, to give voice to a growing majority of people with the ultimate goal of leading to a more representative democracy. We don't do subscriptions or paywalls because we believe the message of Progress is one that everyone should be able to access, learn from, and act on. So if you've become a regular listener, thank you. We could also use your financial support, and no donation is too small. Thanks to Dolores Garcia and Jim Bates for joining the team.
And Progress Texas is heading to my hometown. We're proud to welcome San Antonio Mayor Ron Nirenberg as our guest for a live podcast taping at our Party for Progress in Saytown on Tuesday, May 6th. And you're invited. We look forward to a long overdue visit to the Alamo City, thanks to Austin Kaplan and the Kaplan Law Firm, Shannon Hernzier, Julian Reeves, Tracy Miller, and Will Judy for their generous support. And with that, from everyone at Progress Texas, thank you for listening and for all you do to press progress forward here in the Lone Star State. We'll see you next time.